Welcome. I'm James Calicut, Waterfowl and Upland Game Bird Extension Specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Game Bird University. All right, well, we're right slap in the middle of turkey season, and we haven't really done a full episode dedicated to turkeys yet, which is surprising, but we started this back in the fall, so hadn't had the time of the year right. But today, Mark and I have Adam Butler, former turkey program coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks. So when it comes to turkeys in Mississippi, I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with. And Butler, forgive me, but I have forgotten your new title, so I don't even...
Yeah, Director of Conservation Development. So I'm trying to make sure we have a bright future for funding conservation down the road.
Is that the job description?
You like that?
Yeah, sounds pretty good.
A happy title, huh?
Yeah.
Sounds ambitious, uplifting.
Yeah.
That's how I am, Mark. Bright and uplifting, man.
If you say so.
Yeah. Gives me just a feeling of hope, Butler, you know. But anyway, Mark, what do you think we ought to start off with first? So,
I think we should probably delve into some of the research that the MDWFP has funded through the university that Adam and I and Dana Moore have been working on. And there's two kind of sections of that. And I think that'll probably lead to some fun discussion since there's some similar work being done around the country. But I'll let Butler, or I can describe it. But yeah, man, we had Butler, just tell them kind of what we were kind of aiming for, what you were dealing with from the state side, and then how we got to the research we've been doing with y'all and the two kind of approach we took with the WMA experiment and the population modeling. And I think that'll take us down some pretty cool conversation in terms of kind of where turkey research is and what we need to be talking about and focusing on.
Yeah. Well, I'll even back that up just a little bit to put kind of a starting place in that. So I work for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks state agency here in Mississippi. And you guys obviously work for Mississippi State University, which is the land-grant university here. And, we have a really long, rich history of doing wildlife research together. A lot of states do it all sorts of different ways, but, I'm really proud of, what's really a nearly 50-year relationship between my state agency and the College of Forest Resources up there. We essentially work almost in tandem with you guys, like y'all are just the research branch of our agency. You know what I mean? So long track record of doing a lot of stuff there. The particular projects you're talking about, are just one of many we've done with Mississippi State on turkeys. Going all the way back to like the Dr. George Hurst and some of the stuff he was doing in the 80s and 90s and on to the present day. But, several years ago, we were, as a state agency, we were getting a lot of questions about turkey season. Mississippi has traditionally had one of the more, if not the most liberal turkey season in the country. In terms of total days of turkey hunting, we start really early in the breeding season of the bird, and there's some reasons to maybe want to be a little bit concerned about that. And so, we were getting a lot of questions because we were in, fair to say, kind of a downturn in turkey populations across Mississippi and a lot of the South. And, we needed answers. We needed answers on, what changing season frameworks would do. A lot of hunters were asking us to shorten the season or reduce the bag limit or, do like some states do and close midday. All number of different ideas were floating out there. But I really firmly believe if we're talking about hunting opportunity and, people's ability to get out in the woods and enjoy the resource, that we owe it to them to have that be a science-driven approach. And so that was, I guess, kind of what teed up the stuff that we recently wrapped up with you guys.
Yeah. Like you said, long history of working with the university, obviously. So the two things we did that I think be the main topics of discussion was kind of and I can give kind of the overview of the stuff if we want, but I wanted to start with the WMA experiment just because y'all started that before I got here. So what kind of led to y'all starting that, what y'all are working on with that, and then we can talk about the results and stuff. But that part was y'all were ahead of a lot of folks in terms of what you were trying to accomplish there. So
So
what happened there?
really, that I almost want to go back nearly a decade on that, because again, if you start looking at all the data that we had, and not just us but other state agencies, starting in kind of the late 2000s, early 2000 teens, almost every indice we had on turkeys was taking a downturn, and it was reflected in harvest. Hunters were seeing it, we're hearing those complaints, and we at that time went about trying to create or update. We had sort of a strategic management plan for the turkey program, but it had not been updated in a while. And so we went about trying to build out a more comprehensive kind of game plan on what our agency was going to do with turkeys going forward. And part of that process was getting together a lot of different wildlife professionals, not just within the agency, but from around the state, different people with different expertise, public land, private lands, hunters, our law enforcement officers, all sorts of different people to get them together and kind of just talk about issues. And one common theme that kept coming up was that we really need to take a look at our season, that our season was too long. That was it got said over and over again. The season's too long. We start too early. And different people would have different reasons for why they would justify thinking we needed to change that. But long and short of it is that was almost a universal thought, that we needed a different season framework that probably should be shorter and probably should start a little bit later. Honestly, Mississippi's a conservative state politically, and traditionally our agency and commission's philosophy has been to kind of allow private landowners to sort of have maximum flexibility to manage as they see fit. So when you start talking about reducing opportunities, we knew going in that was going to get looked at really closely. I mean, especially if we're talking about on a statewide level, you better have some ammunition if you're going to justify that and try to get it into policy. So at that time, honestly, we were thinking, we needed to be able to show some success at what we might gain from a shorter, later season, so that would build momentum for an argument at the statewide level. And, I'll be first to tell anybody, I thought, I don't want to jump too far ahead right away, but I was in the camp that I thought that was probably going to end up providing a better situation for hunters, having a shorter, later season, that we would see benefits out of that would be something hunters would appreciate. And, once we were able to demonstrate success at a small scale, we would make an argument for making it a statewide scale. So we decided that the best way to do that would be to use our WMAs as sort of a test case for what would happen. And so we took 5 WMAs within our WMA system, and that gets me off the top of my head how many of our WMAs offer turkey hunting. We got about 55 or a little more total wildlife management areas in the state, and I'm going to say about 40 of those offer turkey hunting in some form or fashion. But don't hold me to that. That's just off the top of my head. So we decided to take 5 that kind of ran the gamut of different habitat types, different ownership patterns. Some of those are Forest Service areas, some of those are state-owned areas. And then we wanted to make sure they were somewhat well distributed across the state. And then each of those have sort of sister WMA that was kind of like kind nearby, similar sort of area that we would keep the normal framework on. And that whole concept kind of came about as a result of that comprehensive plan we were putting together. And we implemented those changes in 2019. So we would have recommended the changes in 2018 to go into effect the following year. And I can remember, getting a few years ago now, but I remember being very surprised, because I was fully expecting that we were going to get just totally lambasted by the public that used those areas about taking that opportunity away and reducing those seasons. And it honestly was one of the biggest shockers of my career that we didn't. Most of the people, almost all the comments we got about that were positive, that the public saw that as us trying to, do something proactively to figure out what's going on or figure out what solutions might be. And I'm not going to say we didn't have anybody that complained about it, but by far most people were accepting of those changes. So that was the deal. We wanted to kind of have those two frameworks, one where we moved the season back, made it shorter, and the other one where we kind of kept it with Mississippi's traditional statewide season and just compare those over time. We have an advantage here, maybe that you don't have in some other states, where we require hunters on our WMAs to record data for us. So they're telling us at the end of their hunt how many turkeys they heard, how many they saw, what, was it gobblers or hens or jakes or something like that. That's a data set that we've been collecting for 30 years now. And don't get me wrong, I would never stand here and say that data is perfect and that every hunter is telling us the exact truth of their experience. But we really had no reason to think there was
Turkey hunters don't lie.
Yeah, I know they lie a little bit, but there was really no reason to think there were going to be reporting differences between the WMAs, I guess. So even though the data wasn't going to be perfect, it was for sure going to be biased. The bias should be equal across all the different areas, which means the comparison would still be a valid comparison, even if the data wasn't exactly precise,
Yeah, and just to take a step or two back, you mentioned not being surprised that the public was fairly supportive of it. If I'm thinking back to that period, because I wasn't really getting into the turkey world when all that was going on, but it seemed like even as a quail biologist, there was a lot of discussion on social media and other places about the idea that starting the season later. I mean, I think a bunch of y'all had a paper come out. I can't remember what year that came out. Seattle maybe, but it was in the ether, right? It was, people were talking about that as a potential way to address what people were observing. So that just shows you the power of kind of the social media campaigns and things. That it was out there, people were talking about it. And then for any listeners who maybe are curious why they thought that was. And Butler, I'm going to try to walk through the logic here, and you correct me if I messed anything up. The leading assumption at the time was that when a season starts too early relative to the onset of breeding and incubation, if you inadvertently shot too many dominant gobblers, you would then, before they were able to breed hens, it would disrupt the dominance hierarchy amongst the exploded lek breeding system they have, and that delay in reestablishing dominance amongst the remaining toms would take some time, which would delay when dominant toms would then breed those hens, which would delay the onset of incubation, which the later you get with any nesting bird, especially the ground nesting bird, nest success goes down. And if nest success goes down, you have lower nest success, fewer poults being recruited into the population, and therefore contributing in some part to what people were describing as a decline. Is that a fair rendition of it?
Yeah, that's the Cliff Notes version. And if we went back in time, you mentioned a paper, the Turkey Working Group, the Southeastern State Agency's Turkey Working Group, we put together a paper that sort of, it spelled out just some of the concerns around what you just described and why state agencies needed to be careful with how they approach setting their season, particularly moving it earlier. And so at the time, I was definitely like in the camp that this is something to be very worried about. Now, you got to understand, too, that Mississippi, that idea, the gist of that hypothesis you just laid out was not a recent thing. It has been around for decades, okay? And Mississippi has always been a state that kind of didn't follow the script. We never always had a very early opening season. And so from my perspective, there's a lot, and I still am in the camp of there's a lot there. It is that hypothesis is not at all outlandish. There's a lot of reason to think those things, a lot of real reason to think those things, particularly if you look at some other game birds and look at some of their breeding systems and some of the stuff we know about some of the other lekking species, like some of the prairie grouse and stuff like that. There's been a couple of studies that have been done on turkeys and kind of looking at who parents who, and those kind of things. And then you just look at turkeys themselves and the degree to which they go through these elaborate courtship displays and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot there to consider. I don't at all discount that as a hypothesis. To this day, I don't. But my perspective was that even though all of that sort of makes sense, it had not really been tested very well in a real world way. And I'm not saying so that was sort of what we wanted to do was just see what happens. And we felt like, from a state agency standpoint, it's a lot easier to implement a policy on a WMA than it is at the statewide level. So our goal was, let's do this at a local level. If it has success, we can then begin to make an argument about changing a statewide season. And so that's how that WMA experiment was set up.
And I think to your point that it's a valid hypothesis, 100%. And there's a lot of pieces that seem to make sense. What I used to tell students in class is sometimes what makes sense, population dynamics is always more complicated than we want to believe. There is certainly, especially like you said, mentioning the other lekking species, which again, and there was some captive research, I think, with domesticated turkeys that contributed to as well. There's all these different pieces of evidence you could draw to make one logical conclusion lead to the next. And at the end of the day, you've got a fairly linear explanation on why that would be a good hypothesis. But to your point, the turkey literature at the time had done a lot about looking at, the number of graphs you see where you look at the distribution of incubation dates, and then somebody puts a vertical line where the season starts, and it's more times than not seems to be in front of it, which would indicate, according to, like you said, this hypothesis has been around for decades from Healy and others, that we're Mississippi especially, we're definitely shooting birds well before we hit that period, and 2-3 weeks even, because I think 50% of our birds are shot in the first couple of weeks. Is that right?
Yeah. About half of our harvest takes place in the first 2 weeks.
Yeah. So surely that's the case. But the other side of that, and then we'll get to what that experiment showed, is, and this is what makes it complicated, why even though it makes perfect sense that it could be a hypothesis, how badly it needed to be robustly tested, because there's all these other assumptions built into that hypothesis that need to be met for that logic we just described to kind of manifest itself. And there's a lot of variability in some of that could make it where it might not be able to be detected, or might not happen, or might not happen at a magnitude that you can detect it with the current technology we're using for turkeys. Because at the end of the day, we don't really have a good way of counting turkeys. Most of the states are basing their population, Mississippi, we can get into that a little bit, is a little bit different, but the trends are in harvest or harvest per unit effort over time, right? And that's a reliable metric, or can be a reliable metric, but it's not like some other species, like the lekking species, where they have better precision of their abundance estimates than we do.
Right. And one other thing I would add too, and this is just a little human psychology, I guess. So that paper that you referenced that I was one of the co-authors of, and man, there was a lot of debate and discussion that went into that amongst our turkey working group, which is essentially the turkey coordinators of the southeastern states. The real thing that spurred that piece of work was because there were some other states around the southeast that if we went back 15 years or so, 10 or 15 years, were getting pushed to move their seasons earlier. And the thing was that those states wanted to be able to lay out, hey, what are the things that as a policymaker you should be concerned about before you do that? You should be thinking about, okay? Mississippi was not one of those states. We were already a very early opening season, and had been, for 40 years almost. And so it's one thing to say, hey, here's some reasons why maybe you ought to be hesitant to expand opportunity. It's a different thing to take something away from people. That's just human psychology, like if you give something to somebody and then take it back, you better have a really, really good justification for why you're taking it back. And maybe that doesn't mean a lot, but to me, it kind of makes that bar, at least in terms of making policy, it sets that bar a lot higher. That if we're going to pull back from what we've been doing for 4 decades, we better darn well have our ducks in a row on why we're going to recommend that. And you guys know, nothing in wildlife science is ever going to be like 100% concrete. You can never be absolutely certain about anything. Everything is going to be, a hypothesis with some degree of support, sometimes more, sometimes less.
Most
But
of what we do in this field is find ways to qualify our degree of uncertainty.
yeah, and
Yeah,
that's you're never going to be certain about everything. But when you're making policy, again, like I'm just saying from the sausage that goes into the policy making, my perspective was the bar is higher if you're taking something away than it would be if you're giving it
Yeah, I agree.
for
expanding.
sure.
Yeah. And I remember when I first got here and you and I were talking about it, the same boat. I was like, if the data indicates and we have some level of certainty that if this is gonna move the needle on turkeys in the right direction, absolutely. But there wasn't, and I think you're 100% right. And there was no consensus and definitely not enough data amongst the turkey literature at the time to, in my opinion, to move ahead with that without some data from Mississippi. So getting to the experiment. So, and again, qualifier, all this analysis we did with Dr. Dana Moore, who's another faculty member here, and she did all the heavy lifting on the math and everything. So hats off to her. But we get to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so, Adam, you mentioned the hunter observation data I have from the WMA, really robust data set. So we paired the WMAs. We ended up pairing them not just solely based off comparable habitat, whatever. It was based on kind of population trajectories from the observational data. So populations that were trending the same way, and there was a lot of variability over how many years of data? Did we do 6 total or 5?
7, I believe, is what they actually
Yeah.
announced. So three before, and then one was kind of the gap year, and then
Yep.
the 3 after, right?
Yeah, so 3 years before the implementation of the switch, and then 3 years after pushing the season to April
1st. So that's another good thing to acknowledge there too, is that we did, when we sat around thinking about what we needed to do, April 1st was the date we picked. And I guess for the listeners, our turkey season had traditionally been opening on March 15th. And we picked April 1st for those WMAs for a couple of reasons. One was when we were putting together that strategic plan and had focal group meetings, that was sort of a common date that a lot of people would throw out as, hey, that's just in their mind, they feel like it ought to start then because that's when the turkeys are really starting to gobble good and the weather's settled and all this sort of stuff. And then that we kept the back end date the same. So it effectively cut, about 25-30% off of the season. So it shortened our season from a 7-week season to about a 4-week season. And then, it moved it a little bit later. Now I will say, and I always caveat this, April 1st is not, if you're trying to date your season around peak incubation or peak nest laying, that's still early. We've got telemetry data from here, basically shows the same date here as it is in most of the South, where most of your hens are starting to incubate sometime in that, middle part of April the 20th, April 15th, 20th. So you got egg laying, a week or 10 days in advance of that. So it's still early. So I always caveat by saying this is not necessarily a perfect test of the hypothesis, but again, we do have to make policy, and in our discussions, the notion of us being able to, in a real world, ever push it later than that, we just felt like there was that was dead on arrival. There was no way we were going to get a policy in that would be later than that.
And
So
and I agree.
Yeah. So we basically wanted to test what we thought. We wanted to test at a small scale what we thought could be doable at a larger scale.
Yeah, and a lot of the states, to your point, yeah, that's a good example in Calicut and the waterfowl. There's tons of examples of there's what you can do, there's what the science tells you, and there's what you can do, because what the agencies are always trying to do, hopefully, is balance it's a public resource, so you're trying to balance public perception and public input and hunter satisfaction with the science as best you can. So yeah, and you look at a lot of the states that actually did move their season, move it back. A lot of them, even Louisiana, I think was the first one to really in the modern era to kind
Probably
of Arkansas. Yeah, okay. But even nobody pushed it all the way back, to my knowledge, right? Everyone kind of had some kind of a balance in there as best they could, with maybe a few exceptions, because, like you said, that's a tough sell. But so the cool thing, so the WMAs get paired based off their kind of trajectory. So we were comparing apples to apples, and then we looked at all the observational data. And I can't remember the exact number since the last time I was looking at all the data with the postdoc we had when we first started, but hundreds, of records over that time period in the WMAs in terms of gobbles heard, birds harvested, jakes seen, hens seen, thousands. Yeah, I mean, it was
in a year.
yeah.
The other cool thing we had too, we had hunters recording Jake observations, so that was sort of our surrogate for reproduction, if you will. It's not a perfect surrogate, but it's a way of saying, hey, this is potentially looking at recruitment.
Yeah, well, there's tons of data from Mississippi and other places that, good, there's good predictability with, Jake observations and some of the other metrics in harvest 2 years down the road. So so the short version of the results was across those WMAs, with the control being the ones that kept the season traditional and the other ones that pushed it back to April 1, not to April 15. I'm glad you brought that up, so make sure we caveat that. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've gone through it. From what I recall, no real discernible major differences in any of the metrics in terms of observational metrics, in terms of Jake seen, Gobblers heard. And where there were differences, if there was for one control, one WMA, it was pretty much counteracted by another pair of WMAs where it flipped the script and we didn't. So overall, we saw no benefit in observational data, turkey observational data, from a 2-ish week plus delay in the season. Is that fair?
Right. Across all of those metrics, all those different areas, there was no overriding pattern to the data. It basically suggested they were doing the same whether we implemented that framework or whether we didn't.
Well, you brought up a good point, doing the same. What we also saw was there seemed to be, across a lot of that data, there seemed to be some pretty interesting kind of periodicity and fluctuations in observations. And that same pattern seemed to occur on the controls versus the treatments, which we interpreted as something's driving these populations, right? It does not seem to be the timing of harvest to the extent we pushed it back. Keep putting that caveat in there, but something was driving it. And I think a lot of people rightfully would have thought, like you said you originally did, that it would have mattered. And there are situations where it probably will matter, right? I think that's the other thing to learn. We didn't see it on this experiment, right? In Mississippi and the WMAs, we didn't see it. That does not mean there's not a situation where that timing of harvest could be tweaking things. I think it comes down to, there's a lot of other factors that can go into it, and the degree of harvest could be one, and the kind of the landscape you're in could be another, and whether your populations are how they're ingressing and egressing in terms of it. So there's a million population dynamic explanations for that. So it by no means closes the book on that hypothesis, but it does provide evidence to support that, at least at that level of delay, that which is, as we described what it was, definitely wasn't seeming to be, and something else seems to be making these populations fluctuate. And for our turkey in the breeding strategy, it's just as easily, here's how I'll put it. I agree intuitively there's a way it could be impactful, right? It's also equally intuitive that there's a good explanation why it's not going to be probably the most impactful thing. And the breeding ecology, while they are this exploded lek, and there's tons of examples of removing males and dominance hierarchies with lekking species, but a lek and an exploded lek are functionally different. And there's a spatial component that moves between those two. It's more static in one and not in the other. And the way turkeys breed, it could be that we're shooting the dominant toms. It could also be that we're not shooting as many dominant toms as we think. We just think it's the dominant tom. Or it could be that we're not shooting a high enough proportion of them at a spatial scale that matters. Because I think our data in Mississippi, what is it? We think we're shooting, 40%? Is that our estimate?
On the high end,
on the high end.
Of the adults.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if you're shooting that adult tom, you do shoot that adult tom, and you are shooting enough adult toms to where it does make an impact. It could also be that it doesn't take them that long to figure it out, or it could be there's more adult toms on the landscape that are breeding hens. There's a bunch of reasons to explain it. If we could go back and do it again, I think I'm with you. I'd like to, just from a scientific standpoint, assuming you take public perception out of it, I'd love to push it to 15th April, push it another 2 weeks, and then see. And then, of course, if you could do a way where you could look at it where you could alter the range of the harvest proportion. Like, for example, if you're only shooting 10% of the toms, maybe it doesn't matter at all when you shoot them. But if you're shooting 55%, maybe it matters absolutely at what point. And that's the question we really don't know in the turkey world. There's been a handful of papers on additive mortality with toms, in that paper from, was it Sherburne Wildlife Management Area that Chamberlain and them published a couple years ago, if I recall, from Blake Grisham's. I think Grisham was the lead author. Butler, do you remember that paper? Their harvest rate of toms was pretty high, though, wasn't it?
One was, I forget what
Yeah,
the rate
they were
was.
shooting the
Yeah.
hell out of turkeys
Yeah.
on that WMA,
Yeah.
which made that
One of those Louisiana papers, I want to say it had it up like around 70% of the
Yeah,
adults.
that's what I'm thinking. I was thinking 60, 65. That's a lot of turkeys. At that point, the timing probably has more of an impact.
So it's a continuum. I mean, at some point it's got to, right? If you shot every single one of them before they breed, it's got to. But you're right that that there's shades of gray in there, and
was kind of like you and I talking about predator management. Certainly, there's a point where we could trap enough predators at the right time to absolutely shift reproductive parameters in the right direction of a game bird. The question is, what is that point and the timing to where it not only makes an impact, but the return, the impact is large enough to justify the cost, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, shades of gray and a continuum there. I agree. At some point, it's got to matter. But there's some other levers that you could pull in that would affect it more so, or perhaps more so than just the timing itself.
Yeah. And I'm hesitant to do this because this is going to be unscientific. But if I'm just talking as a turkey hunter, okay, if a gobbler has hens, my odds of killing him are very, very low. Like the ones that are out there with the big harems of hens are the least likely to get killed most of the time. If you're kind of doing the traditional method of we're going to sit against the tree and call them up old school style and all of that, that's the bird that is probably least likely to get shot out there. It's the 2-year-olds that are not part of the flock that have kind of been kicked out by the more dominant gobblers. Those are the ones that you really, make your feelings feel good as a turkey hunter, especially early in the season.
Yeah. And in polygamous mating species, the males traditionally are fairly dispensable, but not most critters we don't hunt during their breeding season, at least most birds. So that does create another challenge to it. But I think what I learned the most from that was that, from that experiment in particular, was, as all good research should, there's more questions we don't know the answer to regarding what's making turkey populations tick. And that's the part that you want to learn more about and figure out, okay, with these populations all seemingly fluctuating fairly interestingly and somewhat routinely, what's causing that, right? And how do we as managers understand that better? So if there's a way to affect that through management, whether it be through harvest or through habitat management, how do we make sure that cycle, I hate to use that word cycle, but that pattern is something that we are maximizing when we have good years, and hopefully minimizing on bad years, or preventing minimizing. Yeah.
And I would say one other thing too, from my seat as a state agency biologist. Look, that study, if you want to call it that, not perfect by any stretch. Okay. And there's all sorts of holes you could poke in it. Okay. It's observational data coming from hunters. Like I said, there's potential sources of bias all over that. The songbird world makes a living on observational data, but still, it's right. You can criticize that is the type of data we were looking at. You could criticize that those areas weren't big enough to have an effect, even though, some of them were, in the ballpark of 30,000 acres, some of those WMAs. It's still fair to say, hey, that's, compared to a turkey's home range, that's really not that big, certainly not in terms of a population. You could criticize it by saying, we didn't run it long enough. We ran it out another decade. Maybe we'll see differences there. But as I sit in the seat as a state agency biologist, it has to make recommendations to a commission and has to justify those recommendations to a public. If we didn't see it at a local scale, you really got nothing to go on to recommend it at a higher scale.
Your odds of seeing it, the probability of you seeing it at a larger spatial scale is even less, because the data is going to get.
So again, I say that to go back to, I don't for a second say what we did closed the book on this argument. And you could poke all kind of holes in what we did, but it's what we had available to us. And if it didn't show benefits at that scale, it's pretty impossible for us to then justify recommending it at a higher scale,
Well, yeah, and let's shift now to the other analysis that is somewhat in complement to this. So we had the WMA experiment, and then our goal was to build. Dana built it. I'm not saying build this really robust two-stage, two-sex population model using. When we scoured the literature, did a massive, robust lit review, pulled all the parameters into it, and let the population modeler, Dr. Morin, build this really cool model where we had a ton of Mississippi data in it, as much data as we had. Like you mentioned, that 30-year observational data set. We had data from other researchers. We had tons of data going into it. And then working closely with you and kind of with what you've already done on the population modeling front, built a population model based off, WMA data and data we have from the literature, and kind of looked at how we move turkeys through the season and what happens when we push the season back. What happens when we reduce harvest? What happens when we go to no harvest? What happens when I think we did a bunch of scenarios.
Yeah.
Shutting down at noon.
Yeah, bag limit, changing the bag limit.
Changing the bag limit.
Yeah, some of our hunter observational data, we were able to put in, what do you do if you close it in the afternoon like some states do? So different scenarios that commonly get brought up by hunters.
Yeah. We threw everything we could, I think, that we could model in there. And again, to your point, caveats are important. It's a population model, right? It is a construct, a theoretical construct of what we think turkeys behave based off the science we have. And you can poke holes in any population model, and this one has plenty of challenges too. But at the time, again, you're working with, like you said, you got the data you've got, and people wanted to know what we should or should not do. So Dana built this fancy thing, and she played around with a bunch of scenarios that Adam and I kind of were working in and making sure we covered the gamut. And again, in the interest of time, at the end of the day, moving the season back didn't really substantially increase the population. Changing the bag limit, I think maybe I can't remember, maybe just a smidge.
But yeah, essentially all of those levers you can pull there didn't. It's not to say that they didn't have any kind of effect. It's just the effect was very, very small relative to thinking about the number of turkeys in Mississippi, right?
Yep.
So, Mark, let me ask y'all a question real quick. So, what in there did it see, like, to what Butler was just saying, those things weren't really the limiting thing there for turkey populations? So, what would be one of the bigger limiting factors as far as population drivers there? Nest success, hen survival, whatever.
Yeah, so that's a good question. That was part of it. Dana did a sensitivity analysis essentially to try to see which parameter was influencing population growth the most. And it was, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, hen survival and recruitment to the breeding season, right? Which recruitment is going to encapsulate elements of success and brood survival together. But that when you tweaked hen survival 2 or 3%, you got a disproportionate increase in the population size, which again, for their mating strategy, that's not unprecedented. I was surprised at the degree of sensitivity the growth rate had to that parameter. I felt like it probably would be one of them and it would be very sensitive to it. I did not think it would be that sensitive to it. But the other important thing was male harvest, when you tweak that number, it didn't really have a whole lot of influence on population growth. Now, people are going to say, how is that possible? That had already been shown. There was another study, the Landi study was 2 or 3 years before us, Adam? I can't remember.
Yeah.
They had shown very similar results. I don't know if theirs was hen survival, but it was.
Hen survival was the parameter in theirs too. So two different studies that looked at both population models, but coming from kind of different directions that sort of suggested the same kind of thing.
Yep. And again, like we were saying earlier, you would expect at some point 100%, I'm sure, male harvest and an improper timing can probably be detrimental to a turkey population at some scale, right? But it's not illogical to assume that within the range of harvest we modeled that we had in the data and the time we looked at, it's not surprising at all really to see that it didn't influence that much based off their life history, right? Now, it could have, right? There's probably a point where it would, but we didn't seem to be observing that. And granted, nowhere else in the literature, in the modern literature, is there an example of people documented attributing harvest to a long-term decline of turkeys. That's the other missing link to all this. There were declines based off when people started counting turkeys or counting harvest per unit effort of turkeys over time. Undoubtedly, there were declines. But Tennessee's a good example. Their harvest framework, if you look at Tennessee's own data, when their population, once the restoration and restocking, their population went up essentially exponentially almost, and then started oscillating seemingly at a certain level, which is almost looks like a textbook graph out of a wildlife management population dynamics chapter, right? Theirs did that under their framework, which typically wasn't as early as ours, I don't think, but it was before their peak
Right.
nesting. They were violating say violating, that's the wrong word. They were doing very like Mississippi, although maybe not to the degree, and going against maybe the traditional suggestion. And their population grew exponentially because the landscape probably was, over that time period, was quite favorable to turkeys. And when you've got increasing habitat and increasing habitat quality, it's not hard to overcome some effects of harvest. You in the waterfowl world, I mean, if you if you have a great wet year on the prairies and there's tons of grass for whatever reason, you can probably get away with a little more harvest, assuming than you would if a year where you had poor production the year before and low nest success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff that we need to be able to tease out over time, because it very well may be that in a downward cycle, or in a really isolated population that's already got a lot of problems going on, that effect may be more acute than it would be in a population that's really well connected and doing great. So by no means I think is the book closed on this. And the other thing I would say too, a really common question I get. So, one of our roles as state biologists, and you guys too with extension and stuff, is meeting with private landowners and giving them recommendations on management and stuff like that. And it's a really common question. A person asks, how many turkeys should I take off of my property? And there's not a really good answer to that. So, when I look at
I literally have a voicemail on my phone right now that I got to call back this afternoon with that exact question. Want to know if they can take another turkey off their property. How many can they take?
Just send up this podcast link, Jay.
Well, my colleagues who work with deer a lot, if you know kind of the soil type in your area and the deer herd that it can produce and the things like that, it's not an exact science, but there's some generalities you can go by to say, hey, you need to be taking this many antlerless deer per acre or per 100 acres, or however you want to measure it. That doesn't really work with turkeys because they are so erratic, like you're talking about, these oscillations up and down. But I always tell people, or tell landowners, like, even though, we just spent the last 30 minutes or more essentially saying the stuff we didn't really show that harvest had a big effect. At the property scale, I don't think it's wise to just go out there and try to shoot every single turkey you have. I would never advocate for that. I think, a person on their land or their property, their hunting property, is going to have a better sense of how many turkeys they have than I ever could. They know their property better than I ever will. And so I would encourage you to be, conservative. And if you're not comfortable taking whatever the number is, don't do it.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, a different sort of argument than what we're talking about on managing a population at a statewide or a regional level. An example I like to give, real world example to me, is my family has some land. My grandfather owns a place, and I share it with my cousins and our kids. Okay. In any given year, we're going to take kind of between 1 or 3 turkeys on that place. An average year is 1. We take a herd off of it, and a great year we might get 3 off of it. If I go out there, just because the state of Mississippi says the bag limit's 3, if I, Adam, go out there and try to immediately get all of my 3 off of the place as quickly as I can, that probably takes opportunity from the other people that I'm sharing the property with. It doesn't mean that I've just sunk our chances of having turkeys 10 years from now, but there's certainly some harvest management things to think about at a property level that are applicable at a property level, particularly if you're sharing it amongst a group of people that aren't necessarily the same as what we're talking about when you're talking about how a population is going to respond to harvest.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I was just giving a lecture in Leslie's class the other day about scale, the importance of scale in upland bird management. And the gist of the lecture is we don't have a freaking clue at the scale at which we need to be managing to make the inference we make, at least not in the quail world, and I don't think in the turkey world either. There's very, very little data to suggest we're doing that right. And to your point, absolutely. What we're talking about is, at the broader scale, property management, yeah, you've got to be able to exercise some level of constraint because, like you said, you're going to know better. Like my former student, he owns a farm up in the Tennessee Hill. He's one of the only fields surrounded by a bunch of mountains, and he manages it all really well. He does native grass grazing and all this cool stuff. And he's got toms. He's got them, right? And he has a pretty good idea from his front porch how many he's got at least using his fields. Like he can observe it tremendously well. He is an avid turkey hunter and is a successful turkey hunter as you will find. And even he restrains himself from shooting every tom. It wouldn't just be him. He can invite 1 million people up there for the number of turkeys he's got. I think he's the only open field for a lot of areas. He's got a ton of strutting going on. But even he knows, hey, I need to leave these things. And so I think what happens is, and I've only got a few examples where this doesn't happen, and a mutual friend of ours is the exception to the rule here. When people start and this goes for anything really, except deer. When people start really engaging in management, if they haven't historically, and they start really engaging in quail management, turkey management, even waterfowl management, maybe less degree with waterfowl, when they really get into it and they start seeing the fruits of their labor, the desire to stack them things that they created up starts to go down.
Yeah.
Especially if they're over the age of 60.
Yeah. That's
right? And there's
a fair
probably
point.
some correlation there with age anyway. But I can tell you a number of landowners that I've worked with that turkey populations have gone up because they followed the script. And they're like, man, I just really like seeing these turkeys. And they see that it works. Now, the deer people, I've never seen that happen. But in the waterfowl, maybe less degree because they're kind of here today, gone tomorrow. But for a resident bird, you've got to recognize that you can overshoot very easily gobblers on your property. And the smaller the property you are, the higher the probability that's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point, man. I'm glad you brought up scale. We often forget that. Yeah. All right, Butler, what else do we need to know in the last few minutes we've got about turkeys in the Southeast?
Well, if you got any pins, you could drop me where some birds. No, I don't know. I've enjoyed working with you guys, and I really value the relationship my agency has with Mississippi State. And I'm a proud alumni of Mississippi State myself, and really, think that you guys do a great job of staying applied and trying to answer the questions that matter on the ground.
Well, we couldn't do most of what we do without the agency here. When I first, Butler, I remember I called you on my way to my interview here to kind of get a feel for the landscape, and it seemed pretty positive on the turkey side, and maybe it was a little less optimistic on the quail side. And luckily for me, all that's turned around where I've been fortunate enough to do both quail and turkey research here. What I love about turkeys, and I'm never going to like them more than quail for all the obvious reasons, but what I have loved about turkeys is when you go into it, there's not just a huge appetite for quail hunting in Mississippi, so you're often just trying to get them there and keep them there, right? And to work with a population, the human side of it, where there's plenty of them around for the most part. There's an avid, huge base of turkey hunters, and the passion is not only, like you said, obviously they want to kill turkeys, but turkey hunters have impressed the hell out of me where they're like, hey, if we need to do something to make sure we can do this 10 years from now, let's do it. That has been very eye-opening to me, that turkey hunters have been more interested in the science and in the conservation and possible at the expense of their hunting opportunities that's on the table.
Sure.
That has been fascinating to observe.
For sure. And just to back that up, I want to point out that we just got a piece of legislation passed here and signed by the governor, the first ever turkey stamp here in the state, where the money's going to be earmarked for turkey management and science. And that would not have happened had we not had what you're talking about, this really broad public support from people who, are willing to put their money where their mouth is on the bird. Man, I'm very excited about the amount of science that those dollars are going to be able to gen out from now on for the rest of my life.
Me too.
Really cool.
Yeah.
But Butler, hats off to you, man. I know you had a huge role in making sure the people that needed to understand the importance of that understood it. And
I'm not influential enough to get it done. I'm just the good idea fairy. How about that?
You got more done than anybody else I know on that. And
Yeah.
that is a huge win for the turkey hunters of Mississippi and turkey people everywhere, because the research we're able to do off that over the next several years will be very useful for the rest of the turkey range, for sure.
Yep. Well, I'm glad, Adam. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one thing I was gonna say before we called it quits for the afternoon here. So, but yeah, I agree to Mark. Hats off to you and everybody else that worked hard to get that passed, because it's definitely gonna mean a lot to turkeys and turkey hunters in the state. So, well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we got us a turkey episode in before turkey season ended. So I'm glad you were able to make it.
Good deal. Appreciate it.
Yeah, a lot of people asking why no turkey episodes. Man, there's a lot of people talking about turkeys. Let's talk about the birds no one's talking about. Then we'll come around to turkey.
Then we'll come around to turkeys. All right. Well, thanks, fellas. Thanks for joining us on Game Bird University podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped, or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_GameBird, or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Game Bird Program.